holding Anthony Fauci accountable? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Wouldn't you love to see Anthony Fauci held accountable for his atrocious so-called scientific handling of the coronavirus? I know I would. Anthony Fauci likes to claim he is science, and he claimed he was science for over 2 years while recommending in watery terms so as to allow him to duck and dodge accountability, but while recommending that perhaps lives could be saved if we shut down the economy, or potentially people could be saved from going to the hospital if they stayed home and stayed out of business and work and churches and off the streets. And we might see a recovery from the coronavirus. We might, perhaps, potentially experience lower test positives if people did as Anthony Fauci recommended. And boy, did his recommendations change by the week, by the day, by the hour even. If you flipped through cable news on any given day in 2020, 2021, to listen to what the latest Anthony Fauci dictate was, you would see. On one hand, he was saying this. On another hand, he was saying that. And always outrageously couching his words very carefully with caveats like perhaps, potentially, maybe, could be, hope not, hope for, which would then be omitted when it made the social media waves, when it made the media cycles. Anthony Fauci would say something, perhaps, and then the mainstream media, the social media trolls would pick it up and say with clarity, Anthony Fauci says, Anthony Fauci tells, Anthony Fauci knows, Anthony Fauci, the God of America during the coronavirus. Before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for faith-based podcasts. You can also get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. So let's go through this. Let's go through some of the remarkable scientific statements and claims that Anthony Fauci made over the last few years. Starting with the latest, he claims innocence on school shutdowns. I had nothing to do with this, he said just recently. Quite the gaslighter, Anthony Fauci is. But let's look at some of the other statements he made about schools and reopening of schools and closing of schools and how parents should help their children along the coronavirus path and what school administrators should be doing and so forth and so on. AmericanExperiment.org ran this interesting rundown produced by investigative reporter Jordan Schachtel, Schachtel, a timeline of some of Anthony Fauci's positions on the schools. And I want to read some of them because they're very interesting. April 13th, 2020. Fauci slams Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who announced at the time that he wanted to get schools open as soon as possible. Fauci claimed that opening the schools will get children infected with the coronavirus. And here's the quote Fauci said at the time. If you have a situation where you don't have a real good control over an outbreak and you allow children to gather, they will likely get infected. In other words, he's saying, Ron DeSantis, you open schools, children are in danger. Children could become infected with the coronavirus. Children could die. And then, of course, the water carriers in the media who hate individual rights and who hate even more than that, Governor Ron DeSantis, ran with Fauci's statement to make it seem as if Ron DeSantis were actually endangering children. May 12th, 2020, without evidence, AmericanExperiment.org writes, Without evidence, Fauci claims COVID-19 is dangerous to children, citing Kawasaki syndrome as a potential outcome in school children. You remember that? Kawasaki syndrome? June 30th, 2020. Testifying on Capitol Hill, Fauci says school reopenings depend on the, quote, dynamics of the outbreak, end quote. There's that scientific lingo again. Science would put numbers and fact and data to the reopening of schools. Science and fact would say something akin to case test positives need to be below X amount of X percentage of population before schools could reopen. But Fauci says it depends on the dynamics of the outbreak, which could mean whatever he wanted it to mean at the time. And not just whatever he wanted it to mean at the time, but what the various political and bureaucratic players hoping to keep schools closed wanted it to mean at the time, such as union heads, teachers' unions, such as Bill Gates and his pocket-padding vaccine partners. July 15th, 2020, the NIAID chief supports looking at schools on a case-by-case basis. So Fauci wants to consider reopening of schools for some, maybe not for others. July 24th, 2020, Fauci continues to advance his vague ideas about school reopenings, but again, makes clear that he opposes having schools open in areas where the coronavirus is spreading. August 4th, 2020, Fauci calls for the continuing closure of schools in areas with high transmission and a hybrid learning system in areas with moderate transmission, in elaborating on a scaled approach that allows for schools to remain open based on unspecified area transmission numbers. There you have it again with the non-science deemed science by Fauci. Totally unspecified numbers. Just sort of wait and see. Let's see how it goes. Let's allow a couple schools in Democrat areas, allow a couple schools in areas where Democrats are facing political backlash. Let's allow a couple schools to open and see how it goes. But most definitely, let's not allow Governor Ron DeSantis to get away with opening schools on a widespread basis without attacking him for endangering children. That's what was in Fauci's mind, I'm sure. Back to this piece. Also on August 4th, 2020, ABC reports that Fauci is still concerned that schools could be vectors for transmission of COVID-19. Well, no duh. Anywhere people gather, they are possible points where viruses can spread. This is life as a human on any given day since the beginning of time, since Adam and Eve were booted from the Garden of Eden and subject to death. That's when diseases entered the picture. But guess what? God also gave his humans, his creations, a thing called natural immunity. So yes, there are billions of viruses floating about. But that doesn't mean that all these billions of viruses are actual dangers to humans. And that doesn't mean that even the viruses that can infect humans and sicken humans and even kill humans will do so or can do so on a widespread basis, which is now exactly what we know about the coronavirus, that it wasn't as deadly as Anthony Fauci kind of perhaps predicted. August 13th, 2020. Fauci agrees that the future entails many months, and that's in quotation marks, many months, so it's a quote, of virtual learning in supporting keeping schools physically closed. I had nothing to do with this, Fauci just claimed. Okay, well, look at this timeline. September 3rd, 2020, schools can only open back up once the virus is, quote, under control, end quote, Fauci tells CNN. There's another of that famous Fauci science, under control. What does that mean? In a scientific world, what does under control mean? When nobody's dying? When less than 1% are dying? When 50% or less are dying? When the virus has been eradicated? When coronavirus is no longer a threat to children? Well, guess what? It never really was. What does under control mean? Again, it means whatever Fauci wants it to mean at the time, and whatever his bureaucratic partners in politics and big pharma and the World Health Organization and in the globalist partners, whatever they wanted it to mean at the time. September 20th, 2020, Fauci declares that, quote, some, end quote, schools may be able to open safely, but that places with high COVID-19 transmission levels, quote, may want to pause before they start sending the kids back to school for a variety of reasons, end quote. What does that even mean? Some schools may open. So Fauci gets to handpick which schools open. But other schools may want to pause, may want to stay closed, in other words, before they start sending the kids back to school for a variety of reasons. What exactly are those varieties of reasons? Again, with the unscientific science. And yet Fauci proclaims widely that on school closures, he has nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. And yet his recommendations were taken as dictates by many in the media, by many in the medical world, by many in the bureaucratic offices of state and local health organizations and health agencies and health departments. He gave the fearful the cause they needed, the justification or reason they needed to shut down completely. It was because of Anthony Fauci and his wishy-washy, never clear, always confusing, flip-flopping statements. It was because of him that those who are most ignorant in America, most fearful in America, or most tyrannical in America were allowed to seize the individual liberties of all of us in America. November 29th, 2020, Fauci discovers the almost year-old data showing that schools are not vectors for COVID-19 transmission. That's because Democrats were starting to get backlash for the crazy, out-of-control school clampdowns. He says in an ABC interview, quote, but as I said in the past, the default position should be to try as best as possible within reason to keep the children in school or to get them back in school. Wow, isn't that clear? Isn't that clarity? Isn't that definitive? Should be to try as best as possible within reason. Could he couch that in any more careful, unclear terms? But I am science, says Anthony Fauci. I am the science. Fauci claims innocence on school shutdowns, National Review wrote in a headline from October 16, 2022. I had nothing to do with it. Was it a mistake in so many states, in so many localities, to see schools closed as long as they were? The TV host, Jonathan Karl, asked Anthony Fauci. Fauci says, I don't want to use the word mistake, John. Of course he doesn't. Because if I do, it gets taken out of the context that you're asking me the question on. Again, duck, dodge, Anthony Fauci. Partners in lying, partners in defeat. Could there be too high a price? Karl then clarified. What we should realize and have realized is that there will be deleterious collateral consequences when you do something like that, Fauci said. The idea that this virus doesn't affect children is not so. We've already lost close to 1,500 kids so far. Carl then interjected, but much less than the older population, obviously. That's a good point, because we didn't just target the elderly, even though they had a higher death rate. But Fauci has nothing to do with this. We could go on and on. We could go over 2 years about Anthony Fauci's flipping and flopping. But look, the bigger question here is, first, is there going to be accountability for Anthony Fauci? What do you think? If Republicans take control, hey, I hope they spend their terms, the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next 6 years, whatever it can be, bringing Anthony Fauci on Capitol Hill to testify before the cameras with Senator Rand Paul in charge of the hearings. But in the meanwhile, what motivates this guy? What motivates somebody to abuse their bureaucratic power to the point where they strip individuals of liberties that come from God, by the way, not government? Individuals in this country who are cowed in fear and also burdened by Anthony Fauci's dictates and recommendations and guidance and advisements that were all taken as dictates anyhow. What motivates somebody to do that? So I have a thought. He's a short guy, right? He's like 5 foot and a couple inches. He's a short guy, so let's read this real quick from Sage Journals. I'm quoting, when a military commander told Napoleon Bonaparte that he felt uncomfortable being so much taller than his emperor, Napoleon allegedly replied, "You may be taller, but I am greater." This story exemplifies the popular belief known as the Napoleon complex that short men compensate behaviorally for a height disadvantage. The origins of the Napoleon complex are unclear, but have been attributed to Alfred Adler's inferiority complex theory, which assumes that individuals respond to feelings of inferiority on certain traits by overcompensating on others. Anthony Fauci is a very short guy. He's been in the hallowed halls of bureaucracy, mostly behind the scenes, working busily away in positions of power, but largely without recognition for decades. And here came his shining moment in time. Here came all the cameras. The guy doesn't need money. He's pretty well set off, and he's married to a woman who is pretty well set off too. He's older. He's in his 80s. He's got his family. He's got financial security. He's got all the comforts of a good American capitalistic life, living off the tax rolls of the taxpayer, living off the dime of the taxpayer. So what does he want? He wants recognition. He wants admiration. He wants applause for his years and years and years of humble service to the people behind the scenes. And boy, did he get his opportunity. The cameras just would not leave this man alone for over 2 years, and he loved the adoration of his fawning public. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely, right? And here's a guy for almost 2 years had almost absolute power. That's just my thought. My guest today has a little bit more facts to bring in about Anthony Fauci. His name is Jeff Hayes. He is the producer of a film based on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s blockbuster, best-selling book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. The film itself is called The Real Anthony Fauci. It's available for free viewing for 10 days starting today at therealanthonyfaucimovie.com. And meanwhile, take a listen. Jeff is here now to talk about the making of this film, the motivations that went into it, and some of the more astonishing findings that this film brings forth. Jeff, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
The Real Anthony Fauci. Let's talk about this new film project that you have out there. What motivated you to produce this? I understand you are the producer, yes?
Yeah, that's correct. I jokingly call it my career-ending film. This book was a phenomenon. Bobby Kennedy Jr. wrote this book, put it out there. It sold 1 million copies this year. It was 17 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and still to this day there hasn't been one major media review of the book. They have ignored him, sidelined him, maligned him, ostracized him, and yet it is a spectacular book, meticulously researched, exhaustively researched, and when I read it, I immediately knew I wanted to see if he'd let me make a film out of it. And we came to that agreement. I've been working on this. Of course, as soon as I made that decision, my next thought was, have I lost my mind? As I've seen how badly he's been treated.
Yes.
And sure enough, the film is being suppressed before we even had it finished.
Well, what's interesting is that you say that Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, which I have a copy of, it's great, and he's also been on my podcast, and I've discussed the virus issues with him, and he's great. You say that it's not been reviewed by one major media outlet, but it also hasn't been subjected to any sort of lawsuit that challenges the narratives he puts forth in the book. Is that true?
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
It's where Tony Fauci has this ability to deflect criticism when I've watched, we've got footage of him doing it over the years. When somebody disagrees with him, he'll say, yeah, I don't know what happened to that guy. He used to be really sharp, but man, something's happened to his mind. Or, he does this really dismissive where he doesn't talk about the question that was asked, what about these facts? And instead, he does something dismissive of the person that has those facts, and that's the way he's responded to this. And you've seen in the book, it's footnoted more than any book I've seen. The reference,
massive,
every part of it, and even working through the film, we stayed within the contents of the book. We did these interviews, and I've got at least 5 of Bobby's people doing fact-checking on the film right now. They are really dead on about accuracy.
Well, they have to be, because already, as you pointed out, it's not even released yet, and the attackers are lining up, and they're going to pick apart every little thing in the film, looking for some reason to criticize and condemn it. And, one of the biggest things that bothered me about Anthony Fauci, and from way back, from day one, I did not trust this man. But one of the things that really bothered me was how he would couch everything in the terminology that is very non-scientific. He would always say potentially, perhaps, maybe, and that gave him an out. So when his predictions didn't come true, how much of that is part of this film?
Yeah, and we have so much footage of him, and changing his mind, saying things, and that's a lot of the film. But man, it is so much darker than that. My reaction to him when I first saw him was different than yours. I thought he was. He appeared, and here's this avuncular, grandfatherly, seemingly rational guy, and I was completely unaware of his role in the AIDS epidemic and where he came from, and the hundreds of thousands of lives that I believe were lost because of his direct actions and his decisions. I was stunned as I read his history in the book, and the amazing power broker that he became, from this little bureaucrat who took over a small and almost irrelevant department and built it into, of course, him being the highest paid employee out of millions of government employees.
That's interesting that you say you came at Anthony Fauci with a clean slate, an open mind. So that just makes your film all the more powerful because you're acknowledging that you had no agenda when you started this project. So you say it's even darker than what I just described Anthony Fauci. How so? What did you find some of the darkest instances?
Well, in 1984, that was a watershed year. That was the year he took over the infectious disease department at NIH, and the AIDS epidemic was starting, and he wrestled control of that for his department. And then the budgets that came along with that, and he built this $1.7 billion a year budget that he started controlling the purse strings of what got studied and what didn't. If you remember the movie that from Matthew McConaughey and the Dallas Buyers Club, about we had all these people with AIDS that had drugs that were saving their lives that they couldn't get in the United States, and they were smuggling them in from Mexico just to stay alive. When Tony Fauci was asked about those drugs, he said, well, there's no studies on them, even though they had doctors telling him, hey, these are working. He wouldn't fund the studies, and he would only thing they could legally do was AZT, which at that time was the most deadly chemotherapy drug that had ever been created in mankind's history. And this is, it was an expensive drug at the time, $10,000 a year. And that's where he put all of the research and all of the attention. Then when COVID came along, he did the exact same playbook. We had frontline doctors saying, hey, ivermectin is working, hydroxychloroquine is working, with quercetin and vitamin D and all these things. They were getting actual results with patients over and over and over. He was not only dismissive of those drugs, but ridiculed them, and only wanted to put research and allow people to use remdesivir, which was so deadly. It was an Ebola drug that they decided was too dangerous for Ebola patients. And this is what they put out there, and this is what they gave to thousands and thousands of early patients with COVID. It was so deadly, nurses started calling it run death is near instead of remdesivir.
Wow. So, Jeff, you put a lot of research into making this film. What is the motivation of Anthony Fauci? What drives him? What is the psychological makeup of him?
So that's a fascinating question, and I have no facts on it. I'm really trying to.
Right.
But I'm trying to follow. Robert Malone is in the film, and Robert Malone, whenever we interview him, we always ask him that exact question, and he will never answer, and he's really good about sticking to the facts. And I'm really trying to do that on this project. I have my own opinion. I don't think he's motivated by money, but I think it's something else. I'll let the viewers make up their own mind, but I really, in the film, we stick to what he did and what happened.
Well, at the end of our discussion, I'll tell listeners what I think motivates him. So.
I was delighted to hear it. I gotta know, it is not my natural instinct not to answer that. I'm really on my best behavior.
That's fine. I appreciate your sticking to the facts. That's good, because facts were too few and far between under this whole 2+ years of the coronavirus, driven in large part by Anthony Fauci and his I am science narrative. In the press release that I received about this movie, you talk about how this film also examines the relationship between Big Pharma and the military. And I think that is a very under the radar situation. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and Bobby really highlights this. There was a speech given by Eisenhower in 1961, and the speech was actually given on Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s birthday, and he knows it well, and there Eisenhower reminds us to watch out for the military-industrial complex.
Yes.
And where the reason Fauci is the highest paid employee of the government is because he has several jobs. so much of his funding comes from the Department of Defense. And, they were funding this gain-of-function research. They were doing it at the University of Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, until Obama made it illegal. And this funding, it's Defense Department funding. We go through some tabletop war games that were played out and show footage of them where they actually mocked up 6 weeks before the coronavirus was announced to the world. They had a coronavirus tabletop game where they go through and show how they need to shut down any anti-vaccine. How are they going to get rid of comments? How are they going to get the public to take the vaccine? This whole thing was played out, and sitting at the table, you have public health policy members, you have people from the press, from the New York Times, you have people from the WHO, but you also have people from the CIA. What is the CIA doing in public health policy? They're an intelligence agency. They're woven deeply into this story.
So there are some listening right now, naysayers, or those who want to play devil's advocate, who would say, you know what, scenarios like that, situations like that on surface seem like they could be nefarious, but at the same time, isn't that what governments do anyhow? Practice and rehearse for the worst case scenarios. And how would you respond to that?
It's a great point. I want our government to be prepared. But this one, when you see how it was laid out, the decisions were made, and then how they followed this playbook exactly. But the question still remains: if our public health officials feel like they need this type preparation, why have you invited the CIA to be a host of it?
Exactly. So Anthony Fauci wielded a lot of power, but he didn't do so alone. How many of the other players does this film delve into? And when I say that, I mean like Francis Collins, Walensky at the CDC, Deborah Birx, even Bill Gates. Do you go into any of that?
Yes, we do, and especially Francis Collins, and especially Bill Gates. And, Bill Gates was the most reviled businessman if you remember when he got smashed with a pie in the face, the Justice Department was after him. He was presented as an odd duck, and then suddenly he reworked his image into that of a philanthropist. And what we show in this is once he and Fauci made a pact, and they started working together, and Bill Gates declared 2010 to 2020 the decade of vaccines.
Yes.
As we test, these vaccines in Africa, and have literally killed, hundreds of thousands of people in Africa on vaccine testing, the damage they've done, as Bill Gates puts his money into this philanthropy, on the other side of it, he's also investing in the vaccine manufacturers that make the product. And he's driving his own market and his own revenue, and his net worth has gone up astoundingly since he became a philanthropist.
Yep. And it's a funny thing about philanthropy that a lot of American citizens don't know, that, you give away millions and that's what makes the media, but you get back billions because of the tax laws and so forth, correct?
It's the John Rockefeller model that he's executed beautifully. And that was one of the more surprising things for me to learn as I read Bobby's book. I had always been very neutral on Bill Gates, and I lost that neutrality after reading the facts.
Because then you started hearing about the Gavi alliance and so forth, yes?
I think there's so much more to be revealed. But what we cover in the film is plenty enough to open someone's eyes.
So let's get down to in the last minute that we have, let's get down to the real question in people's minds. Will there ever be accountability, do you think?
I think it depends on these midterms. And if Rand Paul has subpoena power, I've personally talked to a state attorney general who has a couple of investigations going on. And so I do think there'll be accountability. By the way, I do want to tell people where they can see the film.
Yes.
It's the Real Anthony Fauci movie.com. We're putting it up on October 18th for 10 days for free. We've already been blacklisted. We may have to do some cat and mouse and move it around, but you can see the trailer for it right now at the Real Anthony Fauci movie.com.
When will big tech learn that once they blacklist something, it just drives people's interest even more, right? You think they'd learn this?
It's getting harder and harder. One of our editors sent us a piece of footage of editing he had done. He put it on his private YouTube page, non-public facing, password protected, just for us to review, and YouTube deleted it for violating their policy.
Oh, of course they did, because their policy is one of not truth. So, well, Jeff Hayes, I can't tell you how much I look forward to seeing this film, The Real Anthony Fauci, October 18th, www.therealanthonyfaucimovie.com. Thank you so much for your time and for doing this great work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And guess what? Today happens to be the 18th. So go to the site. You have 10 days from today to go check this film out for free. You really can't learn enough about Anthony Fauci and all the behind-scenes and not-so-behind-scenes players who really had a hand in seizing our individual liberties. And guess what? Continue to do so. And as a partnership with this film, maybe you would like to check out my latest title. It is called Lockdown, the Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom. It's about this very same topic. What happened under the coronavirus, where Americans just willingly gave up so many of their freedoms? And more importantly, what does the left have in store for the future? And guess what? It's not pre-pandemic norms. Thank you for listening. I want to remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for faith-based podcasts. You can sign up to get Bold and Blunt delivered right to your email box on Tuesdays and Thursdays by going to WashingtonTimes.com and signing up for my newsletter. It comes out 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It contains my commentaries as well as my Bold and Blunt podcast. Or you can get Bold and Blunt wherever you get your podcasts. I appreciate your support. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.